Here, the difference between government and society is laid bare. Government is a coercive tool society employs to achieve certain ends. Society, on the other hand, is the aggregation of people themselves and is generally cooperative. Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we have the author of this great book, from which that quote is, Cooperation and Coercion, How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies, and what that means for economics and politics. Dr. Antony Davies is the Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University, and co-host of the podcast Words and Numbers. Dr. Davies, thanks so much for your time.
Keith, thanks for having me.
What is the major difference between cooperation and coercion?
That's an interesting question. You know, we set out, my co-author, James Harrigan, and I, to write a book extolling free markets, voluntarism, this sort of thing. And as we got further and further into the book, we realized that we really need to talk about both cooperation and coercion, because, and I think this is an important thing that many free market people don't really appreciate, coercion is necessary. You know, we talk about things like the importance of property rights. Well, how do you get property rights except by enforcing them through some mechanism? Now, that mechanism doesn't have to be government, but it does have to be a mechanism of force. And so we came to this conclusion that really what we're talking about is a story of how humans organize themselves, and all of the endeavors that we undertake, apart from those that we do, you know, apart from anyone else. Whenever we undertake endeavors together, we either organize ourselves by cooperative means or by coercive means. And the story of human success seems to be one of using the right tool for the right problem.
I want to quote from page 59 of Cooperation and Coercion. Every sentence that begins with "the government should" implies coercion. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. I had a conversation with someone maybe a year or two ago on exactly that point, where I was saying something to the effect of taxation is coercion. And the person said, no, it's not. You know, you voluntarily pay your taxes. I said, no, I don't voluntarily pay them, I'm coerced. And she said, no, really, seriously, tell me. Every April 15th, you write a check to the federal government. I said, yes, I do. However, I do that because if I don't, bad things will happen to me. And she says, well, that's not coercion. What happens is if you don't pay your taxes, you get fined. I said, okay, but follow it through. If I don't pay my taxes, I get fined. What if I don't pay the fine? Well, I get a bigger fine. Well, what if I don't pay that? Well, they send some people to confiscate my car and my house. What happens if I resist them? Well, now they use force. So what you see is government is ultimately a tool of force. Now, you might have to go through several steps of resistance before you get to it, but you will get to it.
Yeah, all you really have to do is apply these consistently. Just be like, well, thank you for enlightening me, ma'am. By the way, if you do not fund Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone, I will have my employees put you in a cage, and if you resist the cage, they'll shoot you. Don't you love freedom? I mean, come on.
See, now, but the fascinating thing is, you can say that, and we all hear it and say, well, that's a horrible thing. And yet, when we say it on behalf of the government, a lot of people just nod and say, well, yes, that's the way it should be.
Of course. So all you really have to do is say, well, if I don't have the right to do it, why do I have the right to vote for Kirsten Sinema or Martha McSally to do it on my behalf? That's what I love about this book, really gets at the foundations.
Yeah, and there you get the what I consider the magical argument of, well, if 50% plus one of us say that we should do this thing, then it's right and just that we do it, even if we're using coercion. And there's a number of problems with that claim. In a practical sense, one of the overriding ones is when we do use government for force, it's not 50% plus one of us. It's the 50% plus one of the 50% who vote, which really means it's 25% of us imposing our wills on the other 75%.
And also you have to take into account, not everyone votes on every law, and the politicians that they voted for are often dishonest. They don't read the laws. People don't read the laws, and heaven knows how they'll be enforced. The Supreme Court says, the First Amendment doesn't count if you speak out against Woodrow Wilson's World War. So it's not as clear cut as the coercivists would like us to think it is.
Oh, you're absolutely right. The analogy I like to use is shopping. When you go shopping, what do? You go into the grocery store and you pick the things that you want, and you don't pick the things that you don't want. Now imagine if we did grocery shopping as follows. You can pick the store, but once you pick the store, you get one item from every aisle. Now, if I end up with broccoli and I don't like broccoli, what can I do about that? I chose this store and I get this. And that's what a politician is. A politician, when you vote for a politician, you're not voting for a particular policy. You're voting for a suite of policies that are embedded in this person. Some of them you might like, some of them you might not.
Is democracy a form of cooperation? Or let me preface it with, a lot of people will say, well, governments, when you're talking about monarchies, dictatorships, oligarchies, obviously that's an imposition. But democracy is a mechanism through which society achieves a certain end. Much like a supermarket, democracy is working through government. How do you respond?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's not a decent answer to it, because the answer becomes muddy when you deal with multiple generations. A bunch of us can get together and say, okay, we're going to establish we agree to live by these rules that we have established. And when we do that, and we all say, okay, we're going to establish this thing, we have the rules, we've all agreed to the rules, anything that comes out of that system, de facto, you have agreed to, because you were there at the outset. But what do you do with someone that's born into the system? So, you and I, we live under the system with constitution and various laws and so forth. I didn't vote for any of these things. Now, the fallback position is, well, if you don't like it, you can leave. Well, but hang on a minute. What that suggests is that somehow the government has priority over myself and my belonging, such that I'm the one that has to leave, not it, if I disagree. And what you find is, I want to go back to this idea that coercion is not necessarily a bad thing. It's sometimes a necessary thing. And you find it in all kinds of interesting places. We talk about government, but think about something more simple, like a homeowners association, where you have a bunch of households that just get together and they decide, okay, we're going to have some arrangement here such that none of our yards look lousy and nobody paints our houses garish colors. It upkeeps the property values in the whole neighborhood. And we all agree to this. We've established a coercive body, but we've established it precisely because it actually fulfills some need. It protects property rights. And government done well is that.
And also, give me 1 second, sorry. And also, you're doing it, assumingly, on property you've acquired through voluntary exchange or original appropriation, homesteading. Sure. It's not like, hey, Mr. Davies, I came up with this great homeowners association for your house. Isn't this interesting? I came up with this for you. It's, well, come on. That's what makes it illegitimate. You could have all the bizarre rules. You can only have a gun on Wednesdays, and you must appreciate the works of Joseph Smith and L. Ron Hubbard. Well, if it's your property, well, then that's not some crazy imposition.
Yeah.
There is a great economic aspect to this book. One thing I learned about economics from economist Thomas Sowell: there are no solutions, only trade-offs. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, that's the essence of economics. I like to describe economics. It's not unique to me. Someone else came up with this, but I think it's the best description I've heard. Economics is the study of what happens when humans' unlimited wants collide with their limited abilities. And that's exactly what trade-offs are. It's understanding that because I'm a limited individual, I cannot choose A without simultaneously not choosing B. And we deal with this now with the coronavirus. The great trade-off is, well, we're going to do this lockdown to prevent the spread of the virus. Okay, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is, massive unemployment, reduced GDP, this sort of thing. You can't have it for free. I could, the phrase that we love to repeat is there's no such thing as a free lunch. That's exactly what it means. There's always a trade-off. Nothing comes for free.
You talk about the value of humility in approaching economics. Why is it important to value humility?
It's necessary in economics as in any discipline. The smartest people you'll find are the ones that will tend to know the limits of their knowledge. Socrates, great amongst them, says, "I'm wise because I know nothing." To know, to be aware of what it is you don't know. And that applies to all disciplines. But there's an extra twist with economics, which is understanding that a person does not know enough to be able to make choices for other people that are better than the choices they could make for themselves. And this is the problem that you get with politicians frequently. They all have plans. They have a plan to fix this or a plan to fix that. They don't know the particulars that's going on. You see, taking coronavirus again as an example. Politicians here in Pennsylvania decide they're going to shut down all the businesses except the necessary ones. And they decided which ones are necessary and which ones aren't. Well, they don't know my particular circumstances. It might be the case that something that they've shut down I find incredibly necessary, while something that they've let open I don't care about. They can't make decisions for me that are better than the ones I can make for myself. Another point of humility along the same lines is respecting diversity. And by that, what I mean is we all have different abilities, we have different desires, we have different limitations. Just because I would make a particular decision in a particular circumstance does not mean that you would necessarily make that same decision in the same circumstance. And so if you really believe in honoring diversity, the best thing you could do is leave people alone to make decisions for themselves, because we're all different and we're going to come to different conclusions.
Does advocating a free market mean every man for himself?
Yes and no. It means every man for himself in the sense that everyone should be free to make whatever decisions they want, be free to do whatever it is they want to do, provided they aren't harming anyone else. So in that sense, it's every man for himself. But you have to dig deeper to understand what's going on in the background. We are simultaneously individuals, but also members of a shared society. And so from the individual perspective, I'm free to do whatever I want as long as I'm not harming anybody else. But from the societal perspective, what are the sorts of things I will choose to do? Well, I'll choose to do things that are good for me. Okay. But a lot of the things that are good for me are things that I can't acquire on my own. I don't know how to paint a house. I don't know how to fix a car. I don't know how to grow food. And so I'm going to rely on others to provide that for me. And what that means in turn is that if I care about getting these things for me, I have to think very carefully about what your needs are. Because you who grow the food are only going to give it to me if I can give you something that you like in exchange. And so in a very odd but very true way, this self-interest becomes very other focused. I have to put you at the center of my life and think about what it is that matters to you, because if I deliver that to you, you will exchange to me the things that matter to me. And you see this with businesses, right? What happened with the start of the coronavirus? The very first thing is that businesses started figuring out ways to help their customers. They did the grocery stores did this thing about their they have hours set aside in the mornings for the elderly. So if you're older, if you're in a high risk population, you can come in. And why in the morning? Because this is the time when the store has just been cleaned down. It's the least chance of catching something. And nobody ordered the stores to do that. They came up with it on their own. Why? Because they're very concerned with their customers and what is it that they can do to make their customers as happy as possible. They put their customers at the center of their lives. not necessarily because they're altruistic, but because they're members of a shared community, and they know that they, the store, can get what they want, which is sales of their product, provided they deliver to the customers what the customers want.
I want to refer to page 100 of Cooperation and Coercion. You reference a case of gun control in 1996 in Australia, where after the implementation of the gun buyback, can't buy back what you never owned, after the gun confiscation, gun homicides declined 22%. What they don't mention is in the same 7-year period, gun violence declined 29% in the United States. I'm curious, what does this tell us about looking at statistics? Is it enough to just say, look at one law, implement it here and here, and then we know what it is? Or are people so diverse in so many different regions, all we could really use is a logical approach to these things, or does it have to be also empirical?
Well, I think as with any science, you start off with some theory, some hypothesis of how people behave, but then you've got to put that hypothesis to the test and look at the data. And if the data don't confirm the hypothesis, if they refute the hypothesis, you probably need to come up with a new hypothesis. Now, it's much more fuzzy with economics because of all sorts of randomness that you tend not to get nearly as much in the physical sciences. And so an experiment, a set of data in economics is not definitive as it would be in the physical sciences, but it is telling. It points us in a direction. Now, will one study tell me that gun buybacks are good versus bad? No, it won't. But repeated studies under different conditions, different circumstances can very well point in that direction. And the direction they seem to be pointing is one that would conform to a more reasonable hypothesis. And I'll give you two competing hypotheses. One is, if I confiscate guns, people will stop killing each other. The other is, the problem isn't guns, the problem is people killing each other. If you take away the guns, they'll still kill each other. They'll just find something else to use. Now, this latter hypothesis seems more reasonable because it seems not to contradict human behavior. If you've got a person who's hell-bent on killing people, taking away his gun is not going to stop that. That's what this hypothesis says. If I take away your gun, I'll stop it. This hypothesis says, well, if I take away your gun, you're just going to find something else. And lo and behold, if you look at the Australian data, what you find is that over this period where they confiscated the guns, they had this big gun buyback program, homicides by gun dropped, but homicides by knife went up. And if you put them together, the combined homicides actually did go down a bit, but not nearly as much as what the gun homicides went down. What was happening is people were conforming to the second hypothesis. They were simply shifting. They decided they want to kill somebody. I'm going to use something else because you've taken away my gun.
And also, you can already see that it was that gun violence in Australia was already drastically declining, going back towards the end of the 80s. This is much like the OSHA or the child labor argument. Look, since OSHA started, occupational safety and health, worker deaths have dropped drastically. It's like, oh yeah, I guess we do need OSHA. Wait a second. What did it look like before the implementation? And it was going down at a faster rate. Same thing with child labor after the implementation of those laws. The lying with statistics, we can never escape it. You use I'm sorry, did you want to comment?
No.
You use three or about four excellent examples of cooperation and coercion. You go into taxes, minimum wage, gun control, and the war on nouns, which I want to get to later. I want to give you a couple new ones and get us understanding the thought process of how to approach these problems. So let's say there is a global pandemic and a virus that many people are afraid of killing them. How should we approach this? Through the mechanism of coercion or cooperation?
That's a good question because there are two issues involved here. One, of course, is the freedom to do as you will, but there's another issue, which is an externality. And externalities are one of the instances in which the use of coercion is actually a good thing because you're protecting property rights. the let me shift the ground for a little bit and think about the case of pollution. If I've got a factory, I live downstream from the factory, and the factory starts, throwing, junk and chemicals into the river, and it comes down, it smells bad, and I'm coughing, and it kills my dog, and the grass is all dead, this sort of thing. Clearly, this is a point where coercion should be used, because this factory has imposed harm on me, and I deserve some recompense for that. Okay, so let's talk about the virus. Viruses look a lot like pollution. If you have the virus and you go walking about, you're spreading this to other people. You are doing something very similar to the factory dumping the pollution in the river. And so it at least raises the question that perhaps this is a good place to use coercion. Now, what we suggest in the book is that coercion is this double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's very tempting to use it because we can imagine all sorts of wonderful things happening if we just forced people to do these following things. However, it's a very blunt tool. I liken it to a chainsaw. It's incredibly powerful. There are certain jobs that require that tool and no other tool. But if you start waving around at every problem that comes along, you're just going to hurt somebody. And so here, I think the right answer, or an answer to your question, is, yeah, I think coercion is necessary, but you want to use the lightest touch possible. And if that means restricting a certain demographic, people who are much more apt to spread the disease, or people who are much more apt to die from the disease, something like that, that's probably a reasonable thing to do. What I suspect is not reasonable is what we've done, which is waving the chainsaw at everything and saying we're going to shut the whole economy down. Now, this goes back to your original question of trade-offs, right? So we gain something by shutting down the whole economy, is that people aren't dying in numbers that they would otherwise. But the cost is that people are going to start dying from other things, the problems associated with poverty, with unemployment, with domestic violence, with depression. We're going to start to see numbers there.
Let's say that a general demographic, let's say a country of people, lacks education, and I want people to be more educated. How should I approach this? Through cooperation or coercion?
Well, I got to back up a minute, because you started off by saying, I want people to be educated. Okay, but if we take seriously the idea of diversity, why should your opinion as to people being educated, why should that matter more than mine? Which is, my opinion is people shouldn't be educated. And notice what we have here. We have to make a choice. Either there's something about you that your opinion should matter more than mine, and so we should use coercion and just require that people be educated. Or alternatively, we take seriously this point of diversity and equality, and we say, okay, Keith believes people should be educated, so he should be free to go out and purchase an education. And Davies believes people shouldn't be, so he should be free not to purchase an education. And we go about our business. And it starts to look very much like I don't like broccoli and you do. And we just do what is good for us. Now, could it be the case that I'm wrong? Yeah, it could very well be the case that I'm wrong, that an education is a good idea. But notice something fascinating here. We then have a choice between the lesser of the evils. Which is the lesser evil? Allowing me to go about my life uneducated, when that's actually not a very good thing, or is the lesser evil, to the way I would characterize it, diminish my humanity by taking away my ability to choose for myself and giving it to Keith and allowing Keith to make the choice for me. And I think that latter is the greater of the evils.
So I am very sad that homeless people exist in such a wealthy country. There's a shortage of housing. How should I approach this? Cooperation or coercion?
Yeah, clearly cooperate. Well, all right, let me start off by saying cooperation. If you believe that, and I share your belief that this is not a good thing, that we have people who have plenty and other people who don't have much, you can give your money to the poor. In fact, in the United States, Americans donate voluntarily to charities more than the federal government spends on all welfare programs combined. So we already do this to a tremendous extent. Now, that's the cooperation side of it. That's not to say that there's no room for coercion. because we have to ask the question, why is it that we have some people who are poor? Maybe we have some people who are poor because businesses, let's say, discriminate on the basis of race. And, if you're a certain race, I'm just not going to hire you. I don't care about anything else. That may be a good place to use coercion and to say, no, this is wrong. Now, ultimately, the problem isn't the poverty. The problem is discrimination. The poverty is a symptom of that disease. But you can see that there can be instances in which the causes of the causes of poverty should be addressed by coercion. But again, you want to use a very light touch and only use the coercion when you're in a situation where somebody's property rights are being infringed.
And you use the great example of the Americans with Disabilities Act having the effect of giving people with disabilities less opportunity than they otherwise had. You use the example of minimum wage, where giving people, let's use the example in America of blacks who are less educated and have lower incomes. Let's say it's as a causal result of enslavement and Jim Crow. Well, if this is why Milton Friedman called it the most anti-Negro law on the books, because it hurts those with the least amount of education and least amount of skills, stopping them from getting their foot in the door, stopping them from having a small business that competes with the Walmarts or Amazons of the world.
Yeah, and this goes back to my earlier point of when we do use coercion, we want to be very careful that we don't throw it around in places we shouldn't be applying it, because you can very, very easily end up in a situation where you're using coercion ostensibly to solve a problem, but it actually has the opposite effect, that it exacerbates the problem. And you gave some good examples with Americans with Disabilities Act and minimum wage, that not in every case, but there is good evidence that in many cases, those laws intended to protect certain people actually end up encouraging employers to discriminate against them.
So there is a shortage of healthcare, and it's extremely expensive in America. What are some cooperative methods I could use to get people healthcare who currently can't afford it?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because we've been meddling in healthcare markets for so long that people forget what they were like prior to the meddling. And so we've had, over the course of decades, generations now, we've had the government interfere and healthcare prices go up. And the interference has persisted for so long that people forget that the government is interfering. What they see are the high prices, and they turn to government and say, hey, do something about this. So government interferes some more, and prices go up higher. And then another generations go by, and people forget that it was government interference. They see the high prices. They say, hey, government, you should do something. And you've got to step back and realize that much of what we're seeing here, not all of it, but much of it is actually caused by the government intervention in the first place. We had a problem early on with not being able to get enough test kits for the coronavirus. Part of that was due to government intervention. We have FDA laws in place that say that you can only release medical equipment or tests or whatever it is after they pass this rigorous FDA testing. Okay. There's all sorts of reasons why that might be a good idea, but it also creates a bottleneck that, it can take months or years to get a product to market. And here we don't have months or years. We may not even have weeks. So I think it's important here, again, to step back and say, okay, what would the market look like in a completely cooperative way if the government didn't interfere at all? And the market would solve lots of problems through cooperation. There might be a few left. Okay, those are the ones to apply coercion to. But instead of doing it that way, we do it the other way. We apply the coercion wall to wall, and then people have got to argue why we should allow a little bit of cooperation over here.
Yeah, FDA is a great example, especially with things like face masks. N95s are regulated as medical devices and need FDA stamp of approval for you to make these things. When, I mean, gosh, they can crank out laptops very easily. You'd think the face mask would be a little bit easier than that. The other case is COVID-19 tests in America were illegal and in Seattle, and they just started doing them anyways. They just broke the law. I got that from a video at the Foundation of Economic Education. And then the final thing I want to do on this topic, big tech is silencing free speech. How should we approach this? Cooperation or coercion?
Big tech is silencing free speech? I don't know this story.
So this is the general idea that people on libertarian, conservative ideas are not getting the platform from Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube that places like the Young Turks are getting. Their things are getting promoted. Alex Jones was banned on all platforms on one day. Apple got him. Twitter ended up banning him. YouTube, Spotify. So there is certainly a concentrated effort of non-statists who are getting the brunt of censorship. Let's say, so
Yeah.
look, even if I'm making something out of nothing here, let's say tech companies, that big tech companies are silencing free speech, and a bunch of libertarian pages have been taken down on Facebook. There was 1,000 in a day, like Liberty memes. How should I approach this? How should people approach this?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because I'm in this situation. I haven't been banned yet, but I have, James Harrigan and I have a website that goes along, a Facebook group that goes along with our podcast, Words and Numbers. And it's all sorts of libertarian types on there discussing various things. And Facebook could shut us down tomorrow because it doesn't like what we're talking about. And I wouldn't like it, but I would resist anyone who would say that Facebook doesn't have that right. This is Facebook's product. And I, with Facebook, have come to some agreement. And the agreement is that Facebook shows advertising and I can put my stuff on their site. Now, at any point, I'm free to walk away and say, I don't want to use Facebook anymore. I want to use something else. But by the same token, Facebook is free at any time to say, I don't want you on my site anymore. You need to get off. That's the nature of voluntary exchange. Now, I wouldn't like it, but I think I would like much less a world in which the government could step in and say, no, Facebook, you have to put this here. That clearly is government overreach, in my opinion.
Is supporting the free market the same thing as being pro-business?
No. Supporting the free market is being pro-person. That a market transaction is two people coming together voluntarily and saying, I have something you want, you have something I want, and we agree to an exchange. Now, sometimes those exchanges can really be person to person, right? So your grandmother knits things and you mow her lawn and she exchanges the things she knits for the lawn mowing. But there are some things that are complicated to produce such that one person can't do it. You need a group of people. So I go find a group of people who have various talents. And I say to them, hey, let's get together and produce this thing and we'll sell it to people. And we've got two sets of voluntary arrangements now. They're bringing me their labor and I'm voluntarily paying them in exchange. And then when we produce something, we sell it out to people and they give us their money. And that's also a voluntary exchange. But notice something interesting. This group of people that came together, we call it a company, but it's really a group of people.
Yeah.
And we can't lose sight of that. We talk about big corporations. There's no such thing as corporation in the sense of an entity, right? Forget about the legal business about, owning assets and all of this. Ultimately, a corporation is a group of human beings who have come together to do a certain thing in a certain way. And so to be pro-market is to be pro-person.
One of the interesting things that I noticed in the book is that a lot of the problems that people say will arise because of cooperation also apply to coercion. So, for example, corruption. Well, there's corrupt people, so we can't just have cooperation. Well, instituting coercion into the equation by other people, well, how do we know they're not corrupt? Well, what if there's fraud? Well, what if there's poor quality or externalities or shortages? All of those things, Entering in violence into an exchange that otherwise would be voluntary does not stop these things from happening. I want to give you a quote by the philosopher Larkin Rose in his book, The Most Dangerous Superstition. If human beings are so careless, stupid, and malicious that they cannot be trusted to do the right thing on their own, how does the situation become improved by taking a subset of those very same careless, stupid, and malicious human beings and giving them societal permission to forcibly control all the others? How do you respond?
Yeah, absolutely. This falls under the heading of government as a magic entity. Uh, we tend to think about government in this idealistic way, while we think about markets in a very pragmatic way. So we understand, there are going to be people who will lie and cheat and steal and all of this, and we know that in a cooperative venture, there are going to be people like that. And yet, when we talk about government, somehow it's populated by all these omnipotent, altruistic people, a different brand of Homo sapien entirely. The difference between the two groups is not that there are lying and cheating people over here and there aren't over there, or that there are smart people over here and there are stupid people over there. It's the same brand of Homo sapien in both cases. The difference between a cooperative venue and a coercive venue is that in the cooperative venue, when I don't like what's going on with the people around me, I can walk away. I have the ability to just say, I'm not going to associate with you anymore. I'm going to associate with these other people over here. In the coercive venue, I don't have that option. I can't say that I don't like, what the politicians are doing. I'm going to leave. Where am I going to go? I mean, all right, yeah, I can sell my house and I can move to another state. That's tremendously expensive. And even then, suppose I don't like the people there. Well, you can go to a different country. No, I can't. I can't move to a different country without permission of the governments involved. Oh, and anymore in the United States, I got to pay a huge tax to the US government to do this. So being able to walk away when you're dealing with unsavory people is much more easy in a cooperative venue than it is in a coercive one.
What is the difference between positive rights and negative rights?
Oh my God, we could be here all day. I'll give you the simple version. It's going to be simple because you've asked a question from my co-author James Harrigan, and I'm going to repeat some of the things I've understood. But understand, this is an economist talking, right? The fundamental difference is a negative right is the right not to have something done to you. A positive right is the right to have something done for you. Now, for example, the right to free speech is a negative right. I have the right to speak without the government coming and shutting me down. I have the right for the government to leave me alone. I can just say my thing. Healthcare, to the extent we talk about it as a right, it would be a positive right, because it's not to fulfill the right, the government doesn't leave me alone. It actually has to interfere and take resources from other places and provide healthcare to me because it's my right. And the idea of positive versus negative right is incredibly important, because we can both, you and I, have negative rights, and they can be fully protected simultaneously. Because all the government has to do is not do anything. The problem with positive rights is that we can't have them equally. There's only so much resources out there. And if you have a right to healthcare and I have a right to healthcare, and that you need a ventilator, I need a ventilator, and there's only one ventilator, which one of us is going to get it? And notice we have a problem now. The government can't fulfill your right to healthcare without denying me. And it can't fulfill my right to healthcare without denying you, unless you assume that there is an infinite quantity of healthcare, which of course there isn't. Because why? It goes back to your question about trade-offs. If you want more healthcare, you're going to have to give up other things over here. And some of those things people are going to claim are positive rights to them. And so now we've got this weird situation where we can't be equal in a positive rights framework, but we can be equal in a negative rights framework.
Exactly. It also applies to education, where if I said, yes, Mr. Davies, I broke into your house and stole money, but I only did it so I could buy myself a laptop to educate myself and exercise my rights. So therefore, I have the right to take your property by force so long as I spend a microscopic amount on my food, my housing, my shelter, and I'm just expressing my rights. So that I thought was a terrific aspect of the book. As I was reading it, you go over how embracing the philosophy of positive rights is the intellectual justification for expanding government. Um, FDR had a speech about four freedoms where he said freedom from fear and freedom from want. The two, so if anyone's afraid or if anyone wants something, government gets to grow. Why is it important to really understand positive rights and how we treat the state in response to this understanding?
I think it's important because the more positive rights we claim, the greater the state becomes, because positive rights require that the state do something, as opposed to negative rights that require the state not do something. And the bigger the state becomes, the more um, the more the less able it is to provide other people's rights. So I can, for example, I can grow the state so that we can provide top quality healthcare for millions of people who don't have it now. But it's going to come at a cost. And the cost is we're not going to be able to provide other things like food, clothing, and shelter. Now, if people say, well, food is a right, well, now you're going to have to give up some of this in exchange for the healthcare. And now we're in a weird space where we say, okay, but maybe that's all right because food should be a right and healthcare should be a right. And if we don't have enough resources to provide as much as everybody wants of those two things, then we're going to have some smart people figure out which we should have more of and who should get it. And notice what you've just done. You've completely thrown into the garbage any semblance of us being equal under the law. What you have done is taken a group of people and said, these people will now make life and death decisions for the rest of the population.
On page 106, you have this unbelievable graph on the war on poverty. And you could see it right there where, yeah. Oh, by the way, thank you for also including in the graph the years prior and not just the years after. That unfortunately is a lot to ask for. Saying, and the 22 trillion does not include Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid spending from, this is numbers adjusted from inflation, $22 trillion, to which the progressive would say, thank heavens we spent that 22 trillion, or else poverty would be that much worse. How do you respond?
Yeah, that's kind of weird because, you can look on the graph prior to all of this spending, poverty was declining. And in fact, you see it declining until we institute the war on poverty. And at that point, it flatlines. So if anything, when you look at the data seem to indicate that the war on poverty stopped the decline in poverty and held it in stagnation. Now there's all kinds of, there's no way that you can prove that from looking at that data. However, we can point to some other things. Poverty worldwide has been falling. It was falling before the Great Society and has been falling after the Great Society. World poverty, as measured as the UN measures it, was something on the order of 60-70%. So 60 or 70% of the world population lived in what the UN classifies as extreme poverty prior to our Great Society, 1960s, our war on poverty. Now, we institute our war on poverty, our poverty rate stops declining and now flatlines. But the poverty rate in the rest of the world kept on dropping from the 60-70% down to less than 10% today. So at least it suggests that from what we see in the rest of the world, had we not waged war on poverty, our poverty rate might have continued falling as it had been falling before. Now, but we'll never know because we didn't try it, right?
Noam Chomsky says the problem with free markets is they put profit over people. How does Dr. Davies respond?
The way I make a profit is by thinking about how I can make you happier. The only way you'll give me your money is if I give you something that you like better than the money in your pocket. So I use Steve Jobs as an example. The man dies with $8 billion in the bank. And someone like Chomsky might look at that and say, well, there's your problem right there. Jobs was focused on profit and he ended up with $8 billion and he's got all this money and nobody else has anything. And I ask my students, I do this regularly, how many of you have $1 billion? And of course, there are no hands that go up. But I ask, how many of you have a smartphone? And every hand in the room goes up. Where did these smartphones come from? We gave people like Steve Jobs our dollars in exchange for them because we liked the smartphones better than we liked our dollars. Now, here's the problem. When we focus on profit, we only look at the dollars. We look at all the dollars that Steve Jobs has and the dollars that we don't have, and we start yelling inequality. When we should be looking at the cell phones. And when we look at the cell phones, we see everybody has, almost everybody, it's virtually 100% in the United States, people over age 18 have cell phones. Tremendous equality if you look at the cell phones themselves. How did this all come about? Yeah, it came about because people like Jobs were interested in a profit, but their interest in profit forced them to think about people, to think about what is it that people want, because the only way I'm going to get their dollars is by giving them something that they like. And so actually the way it plays out is not profits over people, it's people over profits. People become the mechanism by which Steve Jobs can get his profit. And that's very different than what you see with the government, right? With the government, when the government wants to provide something, be it, Amtrak or public schooling or whatever it is, they don't offer us something that we like so much we voluntarily give them our dollars. They just build the thing and they take our dollars. And if it turns out that we don't like what it is they produce, they say, well, that's because you didn't give me enough of your dollars. So they take more.
Exactly. Yeah. Government doesn't keep you safe on 9/11, and the amount of its income doubles. We see that all the time. People are stupid. Not enough funding in education. Really? After all the money? The subtitle of the book is How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies. What I think of is today we have separation of church and state. You can be Protestant. I could be Scientologist. Someone else can be Jewish. But if the state gets involved in religion, well, then, Mr. Davies, I like you, but unless I force my Scientologism on everyone else, I don't get to practice my religion. So the very existence of a state holding these things makes people, busybodies into busy bullies, and I literally can force you. Why has the ability to become a busybody become so much easier than in the days of the past?
Oh, it's easy. Well, there's two factors at play here. One is people like being busybodies. We like telling other people what to do. We feel morally superior, and it justifies the decisions we have made. If I can, look at this guy over here who's not mowing his lawn, I said, no, this is wrong. You need to mow your lawn, right? Or whatever it is, or eat more healthy or exercise, whatever. So people on the one hand like to boss each other around. Politicians, on the other hand, like power. And when you put the two together, you have a weird situation where the politician can, in effect, and nobody's going to use these words, but in effect, the politician is saying, you elect me, you give me power, and I'll become your tool for enforcing whatever your preferences are. And so we get things like we have in Philadelphia, where the people voted for the mayor and the city council that turned around and imposed a soda tax because it's not right that kids be drinking so much soda. So we're going to put a special tax on it to prevent them from doing that. This is busybodies getting in bed with government, and both of them are better off. In their minds are better off. The government has more power and the people have the ability to tell others what to do.
It's the bootleggers and Baptists all over again, 100 years later.
Yeah, right.
So we have cooperation, first of all, having the moral high ground, respecting people's individuality, their fundamental right to self-ownership and property they acquire through voluntary exchange. But you also said cooperation also has a self-correcting mechanism. What does that mean?
Yeah, the self-correcting mechanism with cooperation is because I have the ability to walk away from it can be an interpersonal relationship, it can be a relationship with a business, with an employer, whatever it is, because I have the ability to walk away when something isn't going the way I want it to go. The people I was dealing with now have an incentive to think about what is it that they were doing that maybe I didn't like. Now, they might come to the conclusion that I'm just a crazy person. It doesn't matter what I don't like. But if if I'm right, there'll be other people like me who say, I don't like this thing that this business is doing. I'm going to stop buying from it. I'm going to go buy over here. And now the business has a profit incentive to think carefully about what it's doing to change its behavior. The example I give here, it's a beautiful one. Rush Limbaugh took out on, what was her name, Sandra something or other, Sandra Fluke, called her all sorts of names on his radio program, and people didn't like that. And what happened, within about 48 hours, Rush Limbaugh had to, on air, give an apology to this woman for what he had called her. And why did he do that? He did it because he was afraid he was going to lose advertisers. And the advertisers were going to leave because they were afraid that the people who heard this, who didn't like what Rush was saying, would stop buying their products because they associate the products with Rush Limbaugh. So it's a two-step removed force of Rush Limbaugh to the advertiser to the customer, right? And yet that force was so strong that within 48 hours, he had to come out and apologize to the woman. That's the corrective force of cooperation. The ability of those consumers to say, I don't like what I'm seeing, I'm going to take my dollars elsewhere. It causes businesses to turn on a dime like regulation would never do.
A sort of not response to your book, but a rebuttal could be given by a woman named Sarah Conley from Cambridge Press in her essay against autonomy. We should, for example, ban cigarettes, ban trans fats, require restaurants to reduce portion sizes to less elephantine dimensions, increase required savings, and control how much debt individuals can run up. The truth is that we don't reason very well, and in many cases, there is no justification for leaving us to struggle with our own inabilities and to suffer the consequences. The principle that those who fail deserve to fail isn't one that is geared to support equality and mutual respect. I argue that the ground for valuing liberty is the claim that we are preemptively rational agents, each of us well suited, determining what goes on in our own life. The ground for respecting autonomy is shaky. Sarah Connolly says we don't even have a right to really cooperate. How does Dr. Davies respond?
Well, I mean, she says that, and people like her who say those things, in the back of their minds, they're imagining themselves as in the group that makes a decision for everybody else, right? So she uses the first person plural, we and our. She doesn't mean we and our, she means you and your. She's in this separate group that should be the ones that make decisions for the rest of us. For example, is it the case that she drinks alcohol? That's not a good idea, right? Is it the case that she doesn't exercise as much as perhaps she should? But she'll say in response, but wait, I made a decision because I drink in moderation. Yeah, that's okay. Or I exercise when I can, but I've got these other things that are much more important I need to do. Well, notice what's happening. She's saying that for her, it's okay to make decisions about trade-offs. But for the rest of us, no. The rest of you plebes may not make those decisions. I will make them for you. So that's just, it's the height of hypocrisy. It has nothing to do with any semblance of diversity or equality. Now, if she were to come out honestly and say, look, I think I'm better than you and I should tell you how to live, I could at least have respect for that position. I would disagree with it. But ultimately, that's what she really means.
There's a 1954 essay by Leonard Read you mentioned in the book called I, Pencil. What is the significance of looking and understanding the process of a pencil?
Leonard Read picks the pencil because it's a simple thing. It's made of like 5 components, right? And he asks the question, Can anybody make this? And he drills down really hard and comes to the conclusion, no, nobody can make a pencil, because to make the pencil from scratch would require making all of the tools that you would need to make the pencil. Oh, and making all of the tools that you would use to make those tools that would make the pencil. And of course, the thing can't be done. And so he concludes by saying this pencil, this simple device, is the result of the combined efforts of hundreds of thousands of people, each doing a little something, and most of them maybe not even being aware that they're contributing to the making of a pencil. They're just doing the thing that they do. And somebody buys this thing that they do and does something with it and sells it to somebody else who turns around and makes a pencil. And the guy back here at the beginning of the line has no idea that the pencil's being made. If it requires hundreds of thousands of people like that in a very distributed fashion, cooperating to make something as simple as a pencil, imagine what would be required to produce something as complex as healthcare. It's not something that a group of smart people can design. It's something that can only come about in any real efficient way by the cooperation of millions of people, each of them doing their own thing and contributing to this end product.
Sure. And that is, I think, the great insight that it is important during the pandemic. Only essential businesses should be open. Well, you don't know what's essential, number one. And second of all, there are 100,000 things that you don't see when you just look at the one business that we're totally excluding. Professor Davies,
Yeah.
Oh, yes, please respond.
I'll just following with that, I'll give you a very simple example. So food, clearly that's essential. Okay, what about nails? Well, no, you don't need nails, right? They're not essential. Well, hang on. You use the nails to build pallets that are used when we transport the food from the production facility to the grocery store. Without the nails, you don't have the pallets. Without the pallets, you can't transport the food. And without transporting the food, now we all starve. And you see that we use the phrase supply chain, and it makes us imagine these lines of stuff, and we can pick this line is important and this one isn't. It's not a supply chain, it's a supply web. Everything's interrelated, and you can't pick out one and say this is important and this one isn't, because I guarantee you they're connected in some way that you don't realize. So when you take away this one now is going to disappear also.
And as we are coming to the end of our discussion here, who are your 3 favorite economists of all time?
My 3 favorite economists, top of the line, Milton Friedman, no question. Milton Friedman had this ability to tell you you are wrong with a smile on your face, and you walk away happier for it. And the other 2, I would say, are Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams, both excellent economists.
Oh, yes. I love that Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell really showed me that I'm like, economics is this boring thing about GDP and the stock market. And it's not about that at all. And I want to finish off by telling people how important it is to get this book. My personal favorite thing was on page 39, where you actually talk about the rest of the Declaration of Independence. I used to read the first part of this every day in school and not the second part. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that's where it would stop after we'd say the pledge. But there's a comma at the end of the word governed. There's not a period, so why would we stop there? The sentence continues. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Professor Davies, Thank you so much for writing Cooperation and Coercion.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.